Hi, my name's Irene Noguchi. I am the executive producer of the daily news podcast at Vox. It's called Today Explained. For those of you who might not be familiar with the daily news podcast, it's typically about 20 minutes long, and we run 5 days a week. So every weekday, we churn out a new show. We often take one topic and do a deep dive into it. Now, when Vox wanted to start its first daily news podcast last year, they really wanted to do something different. They didn't want to sound like the New York Times. They didn't want to sound like NPR. They wanted to sound very much like Vox. So fun, laid back, a little more casual, but still very accessible, still very informed. So they hired me as the executive producer. Bless you. And they hired this guy, Sean Rameswaram, as a host. And I don't know if anyone's listened to our show, but Sean's very laid back. He will often swear and crack jokes and so forth, but we have a good time on the show. So the focus that we really go for with a daily news podcast for Vox is we wanted to give people the feel, not like you were listening to a professor trying to teach you something in a classroom, but more like you're hanging out with your friends at a bar after work. And you know, when you hang out with your friends, everyone's having a good time, and sooner or later the news bubbles up. People want to talk about politics. And there's always that one friend you have in the crowd who knows how to explain things really clearly. And he's moving around the salt and pepper shakers to explain how Brexit works. And it's like he makes it very clear, a lot of fun. And that's the feel that we really go for on our show. So we've put out nearly 300 shows now and had nearly 47 million downloads. So we have a lot of material to work with to figure out what makes a daily news podcast work. And we figured that 3 things really help Today Explained succeed. The first is that you need to craft a unique sound. The second is that you want to tap into listeners' curiosity. And the third is that you really have to experiment. There's a lot of constraints with the daily news podcast, given the time and the fast turnaround, and you really have to find new ways to push outside the bounds. So crafting a unique sound, the news can be really heavy. Sometimes it can feel like a dumpster fire, everything coming through the day. But you always want to make it sound light and accessible for the listener. Let me give you an example. We did an episode on emotional support animals or comfort animals. People were bringing their dogs onto planes, and airlines started cracking down on it. And around this time, people were starting to bring emotional support peacocks and emotional support ponies onto airplanes. And we were interviewing one guy, and he told us about this woman who brought an emotional support duck onto the plane. And it's moments like these during the interview that you have to just grab onto. And so I turned to my engineer, and he and I are like, let's sound design the heck out of this. So this is Daniel the duck. And we decided to have some fun with it to really draw the listener in, because at the end of the day, with the daily news podcast, you only have 15 to 20 minutes to hook someone, and usually you only have to hook them in the first 5 minutes. But when they walk away, they're only going to remember 1 or 2 things. So you really have to find these little gems and make them shine. So let me play you what we ended up doing here.
As I recall, it had little slippers on its feet, too.
What was its name?
Oh, gosh, I forgot. I was afraid you would ask me that, and I do not remember. You can look it up,
Daniel Turducken Stinkerbutt.
Daniel the duck. Okay, well, you can see the pictures of Daniel, yeah.
Oh, my God, it's got, like, red flippers on.
Yeah, I told you that.
Oh, man, if this duck was on my plane, it'd be the best flight ever.
I love you. Without Daniel, I would stay home for the rest of my life. I would never leave the house because I can't.
So, Daniel Turducken Stinkerbutt. Is it? Yeah, I'm not sure it's. Oh, thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Rosenthal, front row IT, thank you. But you really have to create these little moments that linger, because like I said, you only have 15 to 20 minutes, and people will remember just 1 or 2 things from that. The second thing we found to focus on that really works for a daily news podcast is tapping into listeners' curiosity. And by that I mean 2 things. First, you want to choose topics that people are genuinely curious about. I mean, we cover a lot of hard, serious news, but we also cover things that people just wonder about. Like for me, I get 20 to 30 robocalls a day. And I feel like especially, I'm sure you all have the same thing where you're kind of hitting cancel all the time. But I feel like in the past half year, it's really spiked. And so we did an episode looking into all these like underground warehouses and the businesses they run and how they mask numbers. And it was one of our most downloaded episodes because people were genuinely curious, why am I getting so many robocalls? Another thing that works for listeners' curiosity is catchy titles. I mean, podcasts, as you know, it's so much of an auditory thing, but now it's just a visual thing where people are scrolling through and whatever catches their eye. And catchy titles might seem obvious, but we actually see an extra 30,000 downloads per episode when we have a really catchy title. Let me give you an example. So you're all probably familiar with the college admissions scandal that's in the news. A bunch of celebrities and rich people paying top dollar to send their kids to top schools, and obviously didn't lead to good things. But we had Aunt Becky from Full House. And we're like, okay, Aunt Becky from Full House and a college admissions scandal, what are we going to call this? Becky with the bad grades. Still one of our most downloaded episodes. People love catchy titles, and we found that really works for us. Beto and Ted's Excellent Adventure, Thank You Next, the Attorney General remix, and Lady and the Trump, which was about Stormy Daniels and the president, and still one of our most downloaded episodes. But you'll notice with all these titles, we keep them short, we keep them light, usually funny, and just glancing at them, you can tell automatically what they're about. The third thing we found that really works for a daily news podcast is experimentation. Now, as I said, with the daily news podcast, there's a lot of constraints. You have to be a tight 20 minutes. You have to turn it around within a few hours of the day. You can't really often go out in the field and collect audio. Oh, I think I might be fading here. And so you really have to find new ways to be creative and push the boundaries. So let me give you an example. We were doing an episode on gerrymandering. And typically when you talk about gerrymandering, people will glaze over like a donut. Like their eyes would just roll in the back of their heads. So we had a guy on, and he was talking about gerrymandering. And there's these two terms called cracking and packing. And he's describing it to us, and he's a really smart guy. But everyone's getting super bored, and we're like, how are we going to keep the listeners hooked? So my producer leans over to me, and he says, I'm going to add some AC/DC to this. And I said, okay. So he only had an hour to do this. He grabs a bunch of people from the studio. He rushes them in. He crowds them around the mic. And he plays some music, and he has them yell, cracking! And then the guest explains briefly what cracking is. And he has them yell, packing! And the guest explains what packing is. And I'm going to play you a clip so you can see how it ended up playing out. How to make gerrymandering not boring.
There are two key ways of doing this. There is packing and there is cracking.
Packing and cracking.
Yes, packing and cracking, which I think is probably also an AC/DC song. Packing is taking all of the other party's votes and trying to stuff them into as few seats as possible. You then have big majorities in all of the other districts. Cracking involves spreading the other side's votes out. Diluting them and spreading them as thinly as you can across as many districts as possible to win more seats on your side.
Cause they've been gerrymandering of every district in. Now you're vote on anything. You've been gerrymandered.
So we had a lot of fun with that. But in essence, when you're putting together a daily news podcast, just based on our experience, we found these three things really work. Crafting a unique sound for yourself, tapping into the listener's curiosity, like with catchy titles, and experimenting. You know, no matter what your podcast is, there's going to be certain constraints, and just finding new ways to be creative is what we found has really worked for us on Today Explained and within the daily news podcast sphere. Thank you.